Thank you, everyone. Now we're going to start.
Thank you, Maria, for keeping us updated on the start of this webinar. I want to welcome everyone to the webinar series on tracking NDC achievement and new accounting perspectives. This is a webinar series we implement from the project of accounting rules. So I'll give you a warm welcome also in the name of the project which we operate in Mexico, Costa Rica and Colombia as a pioneer activity. My name is Daniel Blank. I'm the director of this project. I welcome you also in the name of the Partnership on Transparency in the Paris Agreement, who is cooperating with us in the implementation of this webinar series. And both projects are actually financed by the International Climate Initiative of the WMUB, which is the German Federal Ministry of Environment, Nature Conservation, Building and Nuclear Safety. Today we have the third webinar in the series of actually 3 webinars. In the first one we discussed and had a short introduction to the general concept of NDC accounting as it has been framed by the Paris Agreement, and we also had a short introduction to the accounting principles having been established in the same Paris Agreement. In the second webinar on the 27th of June, we then discussed about how existing elements of tracking on a country level can be used to create a link towards NDC accounting, and especially focused on the tracking of progress and progress through policies and measures. And we'll have today the probably the most technically complex discussion on the agricultural, forestry, and other land uses sector, and is probably also the most ambitious discussion and also the most ambitious sector. But before I go into the technical details, I would like to acquaint you with some housekeeping rules. On the current slide presented, you can see an image of the box, of the function box you should all see on your application. And on the left side, on the downside on the left hand, there's a small chat box. And I would like to invite you to put forward any question at any time during the presentation through this chat box. I, as a moderator, will collect your questions and we will ask them to the presenters once they finish the presentation. So I just would like to ask you to be patient, put forward your questions through the chat box. All your microphones are set on mute by our technical coordinator, which is Carlos. Many of you have already known him through the chat function, and he has given, I think, to most of you, and thanks a lot for that, Carlos, a personal welcome. And we will have enough time to attend your questions. So, yeah, as I said, you're invited to present all your questions. I hope you find a lot of interesting information. So I just want to give a short introduction to today's presentations, to the discussions we will have today and why we have these discussions in the context of our NDC accounting project. And this is basically due to the huge importance of the AFOLU sector in terms of global mitigation goals and climate warming goals, as the sector accounts for approximately 1/4 of global emissions. So there's a huge potential to mitigate those emissions, and on top of that, the sector is really unique because it's the only sector that also isn't only a source but also a sink for carbon emissions. In terms of the NEC submitted by countries, around 40 developing countries also included the RED activities to their NEC, and cumulating the mitigation potential of the entire sector, you would actually be able already now to close the current existing gap in terms of submitted NDCs towards the global climate warming goal to remain below a warming of 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And this is, I mean, more or less the sector context, but there's also a speciality which makes it very interesting in terms of accounting. And this is that in terms of MOV and measuring emissions due to the dispersed nature of the emission sources has always been complex. And actually it still is. Even from industrial countries, I think there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of coming to good methodologies that suffice the needs, especially of developing countries where there's a large potential for... Someone is flipping my slides, sorry. There's a large potential, especially in those countries, in terms of mitigation, and also actually a very high interest in targeting this mitigation, because it's often rather cheap and has also huge positive co-benefits. So this is more or less, in a nutshell, what is the background. So to improve the measuring and monitoring of the sector, and to use it for future global mitigation. In this context, we will have 2 presentations today. One is on tracking mitigation actions in the agricultural sector, and one is on tracking mitigation actions in the land use sector. In the invitation, as you might have seen, we actually had been announcing 3 presentations, including a 3rd presentations from our country activities in Colombia, to be presented from our colleagues there. But due to the volume of contents we have already in the first 2 presentations, and also because some details of the work we are doing currently in Colombia haven't been finished yet, we decided to concentrate on these 2 presentations first, which will definitely be sufficient to fill this hour of the webinar we have reserved. And to start discussions, my colleagues from Colombia already said that they would be in a position to present sometime later in the course of the year. So we will probably come back to you with a detailed presentation on the work and the progress we have been able to make in Colombia. Today we will have first, a very interesting presentation by Anke Herold, which some of you might know. For those who don't, I'm just glad to give a short introduction to Anke. Anke is a very much appreciated colleague of mine in the Accounting Roots project, where she gives her technical support, but she is also the research coordinator for climate policy at the Öko Institut in Berlin. And she has a degree in geoecology and has participated at the Conference of the Parties to the Framework Convention, actually since COP1 in 1995. She focuses on climate policy and negotiations of emissions monitoring, reporting and review, and also accounting. And she is a lead author of the IPC inventory guidelines, and has also been reviewing IPCC guidelines. In her presentation, which she will also explain now, she concentrates on tracking mitigation actions in the agricultural sector, which is really a complex task, so that we welcome all clarifications being provided by Anke. And with this, I would like to hand over to Anke and to start with the first presentation. Thanks.
Yeah, hello to everybody. I hope that you can hear me well. And many thanks, Daniel, to this nice introduction. So I don't need to say anything further with regard to myself, and I will directly go into the presentation. The content I selected for my presentation on agriculture, first I would like to briefly say something on the scope of kind of like tracking. Then I want to present some of the challenges in the monitoring and tracking of mitigation actions in the agriculture sector. I will then turn to some of the accounting principles, then to planning steps for tracking of mitigation actions, and then to some key areas for future improvements, which are based on the projects we have been implementing together with Costa Rica, Colombia, and Mexico, and kind of the situation that we found in these countries. But I think those areas are also somehow rather common for developing countries. So when we start with scope of tracking, I just wanted to, like this whole topic is very broad, and so we had to select somehow kind of like the focus of this webinar. But I wanted to explain at the beginning a bit the broader context of the subject, and then kind of like what we selected to present today. So when you assess greenhouse gas emission impacts of mitigation actions, most of the time countries start from a greenhouse gas inventory which they have developed. Then they define policy objectives and identify potential policies. Then as part of the tracking process, often countries assess greenhouse gas effects of policies ex ante, so they make future estimates in relation to their emissions and in relation of a sector or a category and in relation to the policies, and try to get an idea, an understanding of what the potential impacts of mitigation action could be. On that basis, then the selection and implementation happens. Then there is a process of monitoring of progress during the policy implementation. And after you have implemented policies, you could also do an exercise of an ex post evaluation of policies. What we are focusing on today is more kind of like on the monitoring of progress during the policy implementation. And there are also, in relation to what I just presented, there are two methods, I would say, how you could track the effects of mitigation actions. One is via the greenhouse gas inventories. So you have an inventory before you started to implement actions in the agricultural sector. Then you start implementing action, and at a later stage, your inventory should show degrees of emissions due to the effects of the mitigation action. This is kind of like the one generic method, or the other method would be that you develop a baseline scenario without the mitigation actions in the agricultural sector, and a policy scenario with the mitigation action, and estimate the effects of emission reduction between the mitigation actions and the baseline scenario. That is the second option. In the presentation today from both of us is more focused on the area of greenhouse gas inventory accounting. And we have chosen that focus because this is, in our view, the most essential step of accounting for many types of NDCs, nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. It's also a necessary element to track the overall progress with countries' emissions. It is a comprehensive way of accounting of all impacts on greenhouse gas emissions of a country. The impacts of the mitigation actions implemented will not be visible at a country level if they are not also reflected in the greenhouse gas inventory. But there is a big but, that method does not attribute changes of emissions to specific mitigation actions, and it does not explain why exactly emissions change over time. But you can also say a lot of things, or kind of like on the other type of method in relation to baseline scenarios and scenarios with measures, but that would have just been too broad for today's webinar. So I would like to continue with the specific challenges in the monitoring and tracking of mitigation actions in the agriculture sector. Some of the challenges are related to the tracking of greenhouse gas emissions and removals in this sector. So we have the situation that we have many individual animals, many individual farmers which use the individual practices, which implement a specific type of behavior. So when we try to monitor all these kind of like individual activities in terms of emissions and removals, we have to cluster all this into specific categories of animals, of age classes, of feeding types, or kind of like different types of animal waste management systems. We have to cluster the farmers into specific practices and categories, what they do. And that is kind of like a first rather complex step when we try to go into the estimation of emissions in the agriculture sector. Then we are dealing here with biological processes that are influenced by many different factors. We have climate, humidity, nutrient availability, microorganisms, and these are only some. And they all have different impacts. We can have strong variability within a year, but also across different years with quite different impacts. Then we have also the situation that in the agriculture sector, sometimes the impacts of mitigation actions on the emissions or removals are sometimes not fully understood yet. We are faced with high uncertainties in some area. Then we have the situation that the more simpler tier 1 methods of the IPCC guidelines for inventories often do not track the impacts of mitigation actions. And when we would use higher tier methods, then these are often data intensive or require models, and the disaggregated data for these methods are not always available in the countries. This is, I think, a key difference to the energy sector, where also the tier 1 default methods in relation to fuel combustion is rather kind of like accurate at the general level. So that is quite a difference in the agriculture sector. And when we try to gather additional data in the agricultural sector, we need to do on-site measurements of the impacts of mitigation actions, and these are often quite complex and expensive. For example, you need to repeat these surveys or kind of like these monitoring exercises across during several years, because you can have impacts by different climate conditions. When you look at the challenge, then we have other challenges that arise from the mitigation actions in the agriculture sector. Often countries, when you look, for example, into the NDCs that parties have submitted under the Paris Agreement, they are often rather complex clusters and categories of mitigation actions, which include several individual mitigation practices or mitigation elements. For example, in Costa Rica, we have seen that there is a NAMA cafe in the coffee sector that includes activities in relation to fertilization, but also in relation to agroforestry system. It also includes the treatment of coffee, kind of like the drying, but also the wastewater management. So it is really a complex action, or it could also be on grazing activities. A lot of countries have put forward mitigation actions with complex element, and in these complex clusters of mitigation actions, it's not always very simple to identify the exact greenhouse gas impacts of the mitigation actions. Then we have the challenge that the mitigation actions sometimes do not cover the entire area of a country and are only implemented in specific geographical locations. So it could be only in a specific region. It could only be by some farmers, but not by all. It could be only by certain types of farms. So then you get into a rather complex monitoring and tracking system. And you need to ensure that your monitoring reflects those specific geographical locations. Then the mitigation actions may have limited time periods. Some promotion of certain activities may only be during a specific time period or may change over time, or farmers may decide to no longer participate in an activity. And in some areas, you could have a reversibility of the effects of some mitigation actions. For example, when farmers adopt no tillage systems, then usually the carbon stocks in soils increase, but when they start tillage systems at some point in time, like the effects would be reversed, and it is difficult to control the implementation of the practices by all farmers over time. Another challenge is in the agricultural sector to ensure the consistency across different administrative levels in a country. Often the planning and design of mitigation activities happens from at a top-down level. So kind of like it's like ministries decide on what they will promote in terms of mitigation activities, but then the activities are implemented at the local level, at the farm level. So, and then this means the definition and the implementation of monitoring and accounting has to happen in both directions, and a common design process is necessary. And it is also important to define information and data flows between the mitigation actions and the greenhouse gas inventories. And the overall objective is to ensure a coherent implementation of the methods and accounting approaches in both directions. So from the top down to the bottom up, but also from the bottom up to the top down level, because often information is available at the farm level or at the more detailed level that is essential information than at the national level. So in the next part, I would like to come a little bit to some key accounting principles. So the key principles implemented under the Paris Agreement are, I think many of you may be familiar with the TAC principles, which mean transparency, completeness, consistency, comparability, and accuracy. And the Paris Agreement also added promotion of environmental integrity and avoidance of double counting. I will not go into detail of all of those, but only some which are, in my view, more important for agriculture. And we don't have time to go into all this in the webinar. So transparency means that data sources, assumptions, and methods used for the calculation of emissions should be explained, and the report of the emission should also allow the replication of the calculations. So that means that activity data, emission factors, and other parameters used should be presented separately. I think this presents a particular challenge in the agriculture sector for the more advanced tier methods, and if models are used for higher tiers. And the IPCC has developed specific guidance for that situation, in particular in relation to model descriptions. Then we have the principle of consistency, which can have different, which has different implications. It has a temporal implication that the methods chosen should be consistent across different years and across the time series of emissions. It has also an implication when countries use references against which they compare their emissions, either kind of like reference years or reference scenarios. It means that the methods used for the calculation of emissions should be consistent between reference levels and the implementation, or kind of like the tracking of emissions during the relevant period. It also has a meaning in relation to the geographical level, so that the same methods and parameters should be used at different levels of the country, so at national, regional, or local level. And it's also important in relation to definitions, so that the same definitions for the same type of activities should be used across the country in different levels. That would apply, for example, to forest definition, but also, for example, to how animal waste management systems are defined in agriculture sector. We have another principle, which is the avoidance of double counting. This we have seen in the projects we are working on, that it can have a specific meaning in the agriculture sector in developing countries, because we often have different projects and programs with mitigation actions that are implemented in a country, and that can lead to an overlap of areas of the same mitigation actions in the same time period, so that there you would have some type of double counting of activities in different projects and programs on kind of like on the same area in the same time period. And it would be useful to develop a system of acceptance and registration of such projects and programs to avoid such overlap. Another element we have seen in the countries we are working on with is a potential overlap between the accounting under REDD+ activities and forest-related activities and agriculture activities. For example, working with farmers in relation to grazing activities. There we have seen that the farmers allocate reforestation activities on their agricultural lands as agricultural mitigation activities, whereas those in the country working with forests or REDD+ activities would put the same activities in the scope of the REDD activities in the country. So to avoid the allocation of the same mitigation activities to two separate inventory categories, it may be useful to use the allocation as it is suggested by the IPCC guidance. Then I would like to go to the planning steps for the tracking of mitigation actions. This part is a bit less specific to agriculture and a bit more generic, as we developed this in the projects we were working with. So the first step in the tracking of the mitigation actions would be to really clarify and describe clearly the mitigation actions with regard to all relevant aspects and elements in relation to the impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. Then the second step is to integrate the appropriate methods that reflect these mitigation actions in the greenhouse gas inventory. The third step is to integrate the activities in a domestic monitoring system. And then it would be the first step, the continuous implementation and tracking of via the inventory and potentially other indicators a country would like to use. In relation to the description of the mitigation action, kind of like key parameters that should be defined are the objectives, then the specific elements of the action, the question of how the action really impacts the emission, and what are kind of like really the emission reductions that are that the mitigation actions is expected to bring. Other elements would be kind of the responsibilities for the action, and potentially also sources of financial support. In relation to the impacts on the greenhouse gas inventory, key questions in the description here would be: which sources, sinks, gases, or carbon stocks does the action influence? And which categories of the inventory are influenced? And then to check which method is actually used in the inventory in these categories. And is it necessary to improve these methods? And then such improvement could be reflected in an inventory improvement plan. And of course, a very important question is also whether data is available for this type of improvement. We have tried to develop some type of decision tree that guides the integration of a mitigation action in the inventory, and that starts from the point when the country has already identified that a certain specific inventory category is impacted by a specific mitigation activity. So then the first question is this category that is impacted is already estimated in the greenhouse gas inventory? If this is not the case, then the next question is whether activity data exists to estimate such category. If not, then it is important to look into whether it is possible to collect such activity data, and that would go into an improvement plan with responsibilities and timelines to determine kind of like how this type of data could be gathered. If the activity data is already there, the next question would be whether the emission factors or other parameters are available that reflect the impacts of the mitigation action. If this is the case, then the action is already integrated. If not, then the question needs to be discussed how appropriate emission factors or other parameters can be developed for the country that mirror or reflect the mitigation action. If a category is already part of the inventory, you need to go through the same question, because it could also be that the category exists, but that the activity data do not yet represent the impacts of the mitigation action. For example, it could be that it is not disaggregated enough, the activity data, to reflect that certain mitigation action. Then it would also be an activity to be included in the improvement plan. Or it could be that the emission factors are not yet fully reflecting the mitigation action. Then it would also be an area where the emission factors have to be developed further. Based on the countries we were working with, I want to present some key areas of future improvements in the agriculture sector, where we have been going through this decision tree. And that is summarizing mainly kind of like the major areas where we have seen that improvements are necessary. We have found that often countries are missing estimates for carbon stock changes in the soil carbon pools in many developing countries in the greenhouse gas inventories. This is, of course, a major shortcoming for the agriculture sector, because many mitigation actions that improve the soil quality, it could be via the use of organic fertilizer, changes in fertilization activities, improved grazing management, for example, improved pasture management, the use of cover crops, the addition of crop residues to soils. Kind of, there are a very wide range of mitigation actions in the agricultural sector that impact soil carbon stock pools and that are then not reflected in the inventory. I think this is an area where additional support and resources are necessary to help developing countries estimate carbon stocks in soils, and where also additional research is required, because we are really, in the countries where we have been working with, are often also missing kind of research in this area of soil carbon pools. Another area we found is that is also missing is carbon stocks in perennial vegetation on croplands. So often mitigation actions include agroforestry systems, but like these perennial above ground biomass is often not yet presented in the greenhouse gas inventories. So kind of like the changes to those systems, so additional trees, for example, on pastures or in plantations, would not be reflected as impacts in the greenhouse gas inventories. Another area are N2O emissions from agricultural soils. We have seen that often data on average fertilizer consumption related to specific crop types is missing, and without such baseline understanding in relation to existing fertilizer use, it is difficult to determine potential emission reductions due to improved fertilization. And also, we have also seen that in the countries we were working with, that data on the application of organic nitrogen fertilizers is also often missing, and the changes in the use of organic fertilizers is not reflected. On enteric fermentation, we have seen that at least in the countries we were working with, they are quite advanced, and I think this is also true for other developing countries, that for livestock, in particular for cattle, often already tier 1, tier 2, and improved livestock characterization is used, and also sometimes country-specific emission factors. But still, even when the methodologies are more advanced, it is not so easy to reflect, for example, improved feeding situation, for example, when grazing is the dominant management system, and some of the parameters for the estimation are really difficult to measure, like the food digestibility, and more country-specific research in developing countries is needed, because I think also the agricultural practices are different, and that is an area where we would need to have further research. In relation to manure management, so methane from storage and treatment of manure, and from manure deposited on pasture, and also N2O emissions in this regard. This is more relevant when large numbers of animals are managed in confined areas. And in the countries we were working with, that was often less relevant because of the large importance of pasture in the livestock farming. And the mitigation actions that were then used in the area of manure treatment were more like anaerobic digesters and these type of activities, and those were more easier to assess in relation to the impacts on emissions, because the information was directly coming from the implementation of the mitigation actions. So to conclude this presentation, as Daniel has shown in the introductory slides, the agriculture sector is a dominant sector in many greenhouse gas inventories of developing countries, and therefore often mitigation actions also, but frequently inventory lack higher tier methods and related data to reflect these mitigation actions appropriately. And it is important that additional research related to specific practices and circumstances in developing countries is implemented and supported to develop country-specific parameters in agriculture. I think we also need new approaches for data collection at farm levels for the implementation of to mirror mitigation actions. One approach that we have been using in one country we were working with is that there is that guidance in relation to best practices in agriculture are distributed via mobile apps, which the farmers have on their mobiles, and with the same apps that provides them with advice to their kind of like everyday management of their farms. The same app is also collecting data directly from the farmers that participate in the programs. So we don't need to implement very sophisticated statistical systems and additional surveys at the country level, but so that via kind of like mobile apps in that particular case, we are trying to collect this the relevant data that we need to estimate the effects of the mitigation action, but that it also we need for improved methods in the greenhouse gas inventory. In general, I also think that additional support from developed countries is required for developing countries related to the development and implementation of higher tier methods in the agriculture sector, and this is one of the key areas we have to address in the future. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. I'm not so sure, Daniel, whether we should have questions after Sandro's presentation or already directly now.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Anke, for your presentation. Before coming to the topic of the questions, I just would like to mention, because you have asked that in the chat function, that all presentations will be placed on the website of the Transparency Partnership. Carlos and Maria provided you the link in the chat function. We will also show it on the last slide, so you're invited to go there. You will find, apart from the presentations, also a voice recording, which also applies to the first and the second webinar, and also a lot of other related information on transparency in general, which has been generated within the Transparency Partnership. So there isn't only information on our project and on this webinar. So go ahead and check this website of the Transparency Partnership. I mean, as we only have, Anke, as we only have 2 technical questions related to your presentation, I'd say that we might take those 2 and then directly go on with the presentation from Sandro. So the questions are from Dirk Nemitz, who asked, in relation to slide 21, if carbon soil pools would be treated under FOLU sector.
Yes, in relation to the allocation of in the greenhouse gas inventories, it is part of the FOL. Well, it depends like with which guidelines you work. Kind of like it is in the AFOLU sector, in the 2006 IPCC guidelines, and in the LUCF sector in the previous guidelines. But I think it is just like an important part of agriculture, like on croplands and grazing lands, pasture. Therefore, I included it in this presentation because many of the mitigation actions that countries put forward under the heading of agriculture have impacts on soil carbon.
Okay, thanks, Anke. And there's also another question from Harald Winkler, who asks if the inventory report wouldn't explain trends in emissions.
Yes, that's right. But your it is something you need to add as a country, or as the person or the team who is compiling the inventory, that you see the trends, and then you still need to think about the reasons that drive these trends. It's not something that you directly get out of the numbers, and I think when you do other and this understanding you can you get in a better extent when you do the other tracking method in relation to baselines.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Anke, for these quick responses. We have further questions, but I'd say that we first continue with the presentation from Sandro on the FOLU sector, and we will then see if there's still sufficient time to respond to him. If not, I mean, you're always invited to contact us, and be it through the project or also directly to Anke and Sandro. Before Sandro starts his presentation, I'd like to give him a warm welcome in this webinar. Sandro Federici works at FIO. He's a senior consultant there in the division on climate change. He's an accomplished forestry GHG accounting specialist and holds a PhD in forest management. He's also an IPCC author and UNFCCC negotiator, and has been in this function as UNFCCC negotiator for almost 15 years now. and he's also a reviewer of GHG inventories and reviewer of UNFCCC reports submitted by countries. So a warm welcome, Sandro, in this webinar, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you. Welcome everybody. Thank you to the organizer for having organized this webinar, to the German government for providing funding. My presentation just built on top of the Anke presentation, so everything Anke said applies also to the LULUCF sector. I will guide my discussion more on the particularities of the LULUCF sector, so on something that we need to say additionally to what Anke said. This is the outline of the presentation. I find what is the land use sector, because indeed there is not a clear, let's say, a general understanding of what we consider it. Which are the mitigation actions that are likely to occur in the land use sector? Then Anke said there are two options to track the mitigation action. I only discussed one, the use of national greenhouse gas inventory for doing this. This is because, as Anke said, the national inventory report is the reporting instruments under the Paris Agreement. And then within that framework, it is expected that these will be the instruments to track the entire contribution of a country to its, to track the entire the meeting, the progress of the country toward its entire contribution. That's why I think whatever instrument is used, even if some countries decide to go for a NAMA-specific monitoring system, NAMA-specific reporting system, these must be then reconciled with the national greenhouse gas inventory. To provide two different set of estimates for the same variable is one of the most tricky issues that may happen to a country, because then the question will be which is the actual data, the actual estimate, the one in the greenhouse gas inventory or the other one. This raises also at political level that are quite embarrassing for a country. Then I will discuss how this mitigation action may be tracked, and then the result identified within a national greenhouse gas inventory, taking into consideration the specific characteristic of whatever mitigation action, that is, there is a lifetime. A mitigation action usually has a limited window in time. Doesn't go like a greenhouse gas inventory in theory indefinitely. And then to deal with the two characteristics of the data specific of the legacy and the interannual variability. Then I will also discuss leakage and non-permanence, but these are not specific of the LULUCF sector, so I will not say much, but because they are always discussed when a mitigation action is implemented, it's better to show how within a national greenhouse gas inventory they may be addressed. So this is the land use sector. The figure, unfortunately, is quite small, but then when you download the presentation, you may magnify it and then have a better look. This represents all the carbon pools, because at the end the land use sector is about the terrestrial carbon pools. The carbon pools, they contain organic matter, so they are precursor of greenhouse gases, CO2, N2O, methane, you already know this, but it's also the sink, it's a big sink, the biomass. So only one pool, the biomass is capable to sequester CO2 back from the atmosphere. And this is a fundamental characteristic that is taken into consideration in all IPCC scenarios that aim to provide advice on how we may avoid significant impact of climate change on our socio-economic and environmental system. So, land use sector is about carbon pools, is about the emissions removals that the human activities cause from these carbon pools, directly or indirectly, because we have a direct impact, harvest, planting. Indirect impact is also climate change. Climate change is one indirect impact of human activities that need to be, its impact on emissions removals then need to be quantified and reported. Here there is a problem because there is an animation. There is something back on this figure here. This is not the original, but it's okay. So, before discussing, it's important to introduce a concept, which is already in the IPCC guidelines, especially if you are familiar with the soil organic matter methodologies for mineral soil. This has been further developed in the GFOI guidance, the guidance of the Global Forest Observation Initiative for reporting REDD+ activities. It's quite simple. For each land use and for each specific management system within a land use, it's possible to calculate what is the average long-term carbon stock. Here, on the left, you see what is the black line is the average long-term carbon stock of forest plantation. So the forest plantation, the carbon stock increases because of forest growth, then it is the harvest, then it back increasing, and so in average, what the atmosphere sees is this sequestration. Okay. A pristine forest, because it's not harvested, what the atmosphere sees is this carbon sequestration. So you see that even if the two systems may have at a certain point of time the same carbon stock, their impact on the atmosphere is quite different. In this case, it's half of the plantation impact in positive term is half of that one of a pristine forest. So having said that, we will develop this concept for the following discussion. Which are the sources in the land use sector? We have a source when this famous long-term carbon stock decreases. If we go back, if we convert a pristine forest to a forest plantation, the carbon stock decreases, the green double arrow, and this is then is a source of carbon, this conversion. You may have conversion woody biomass and dead wood and litter and soil organic matter when you reduce the long-term carbon stock of a forest, whatever woody land. So a conversion of primary forest to a secondary forest. The conversion of natural forest to tree plantation, these are some examples. Overexploitation of forest, the famous forest degradation. Or the disturbance regime is going worse. Be aware that if you look at the greenhouse gas inventories of big countries, especially of big boreal countries, you see that since 2000 this is happening. Forest fires, which is the most common and also the most important disturbance because it causes large emissions in a very short time. The emissions due to forest fire are increasing significantly in all the boreal hemisphere, but also in the southern hemisphere is happening the same. Which means that the long-term carbon stock of those forests is decreasing, because the forest may not have enough time to recover back the carbon stock because a new fire affects them. But also agroforestry system can be a source. If I convert an agroforestry system to an annual crop, then I lose carbon stock. Of course, any deforestation, any conversion from a land with perennial biomass to a land without perennial biomass is a net decrease in the long-term carbon stock. But also the use of harvestable product. If I have a harvestable product, I incentivize their use for energy instead of for as material, then I have a decrease, because also the harvestable product is a pool, is a long-term carbon pool. At the same when I drain an organic soil, or when I do overexploit, so I degrade the agricultural land, so I lose organic carbon from soils. Conversely, we have the sink, and you see the sink is just the opposite of what we have seen, action of what we have seen as sources. You have a sink if your long-term carbon stock increases. This happens in whatever vegetated land. If I have forest, if I convert a crop, annual crop into agroforestry, whatever I establish woody vegetation or I increase the density of this woody vegetation, I have a sink. These are some examples here. Also, to incentivize the use of harvested wood product as a long-lasting product, this is a way to increase the long-term carbon stock and then to mitigate climate change. Rewetting of peatland. Be aware, between these two sets, not all of them have the same impact on the atmosphere. Well, let's say, are the same relevance, let's say, for our mitigation policy, because there are some of them that they need time to have the full impact on the atmosphere. Some other, they impact the atmosphere suddenly. Deforestation, we always speak deforestation, but because deforestation is a sudden loss of a huge amount of carbon. Then avoiding deforestation is indeed one of the most effective policies that we may have in the short term. Same here, they are not equal. Peatlands, drained peatlands is a significant source of carbon. Just rewetting stop immediately this source. Planting trees, of course, I'm a forester, is the best activity that I may think, but it takes time the forest to grow. This should be taken into consideration when choosing policies by countries. So, the mitigation action. So, what is a mitigation action? Of course, avoiding the long-term carbon stock loss is a mitigation action. Reduce, avoid. Reducing deforestation is a mitigation action. All of us are very familiar with RED, which the main activity is just reducing the deforestation or avoiding if it's possible. This kind of policy that avoid the long-term carbon stock losses are usually associated with the conservation or with sustainable management of natural resources. So they bring naturally, let's say implicitly, also non-carbon benefits, because protecting forest means also protect the biodiversity, means also protect the quality and the availability of water resources. Then, to allow long-term carbon stock gain, still also is a mitigation action. However, as I already noted, the accumulation of carbon stock takes time, it's a slow process. It's important because you may stock in a long time and significant amount of carbon, but the impact of this activity does not happen altogether. And also it takes usually take a time length that is likely longer of the mitigation action implementation. Already noted before, the mitigation action usually are implemented for a short time period. I may give subsidies for forest plantation, for reforestation, let's say, for 10, 20 years, but then it's unlikely that I keep subsidizing the plantation. I'll keep then asking the farmer to provide me the report with the current status of the plantation. At a certain point of time, the mechanism stops. So we will see this kind of for this kind of policies, the famous legacy effect that we'll see in a few slides is mostly relevant. This kind of mitigation action are quite always associated with the policy for landscape restoration, rewetting the peatland, reforesting degraded land, and so on. So also these policies have a significant environmental non-carbon benefit. But because these policies, they always, I guess, let's say most likely, not always, most likely, request a land use change or a change in management, then there may be some social issues to be addressed, because whatever is the car, even if the policy is reforesting at a degraded land, somebody is living on this degraded land, is taking the income, his survival is associated with the current use of this degraded land. So this kind of policies may be associated with some social issues. So, as already said before, tracking the mitigation action. The greenhouse gas inventory is a fundamental instrument for the Paris Agreement tracking. So, my understanding is that anyhow the mitigation action need to be identified within the greenhouse gas inventory to be tracked, but also if the tracking is made with an alternative instrument to reconcile the estimates. Because, as I said, at the end, when there will be the famous global stock taking under the Paris Agreement, what the country is doing is based, the assessment will be based on its national inventory, because we need to know the total impact of its socio-economic system, and not the impact of a single mitigation policy. If the two numbers, those of the mitigation action, those reported by the greenhouse gas inventory, do not match, this may raise issues. However, the issues are that mitigation action are a limited time frame. So the greenhouse gas inventory, it goes from backward, maybe 1990, it will go onward. Within this time series, you have your mitigation action quantification. The mitigation action, they don't cover the international greenhouse gas emission removals. So they only cover a portion of this, of the total greenhouse gas emission removals. Not only, even within the greenhouse gas inventories categories, a mitigation action likely doesn't cover the entire category, or may cover one or more categories. And this is also an issue that needs to be considered. Allora, mitigation action then may cover a single pool or more pool, can cover a single categories or subcategories of the greenhouse gases inventory, or more categories. It may cover the entire, because now we are discussing the land sector. The land sector, the area, no? Is terrestrial carbon stock across the national area. So the entire area of the greenhouse gas inventory category or subcategory can be included, can be impacted by the mitigation action, or a single portion of it. I implement a policies for reforestation in a region. I don't look at the entire country. I'm giving subsidies for this region only. I'm halting deforestation. I'm going for zero deforestation in another region, not in the entire country. So the greenhouse gas inventory category indeed need to be subdivided. It's a subdivision of the greenhouse gas inventory. What is it's captured by the mitigation action. So then the first step to do when we wish to use the greenhouse inventory to track mitigation action and the result is to identify the mitigation action within the greenhouse gas inventory. So which are the categories covered by the mitigation action? Which are the category of the greenhouse gas inventory that are being impacted, that will be impacted, or have been impacted by the greenhouse gas inventory? The carbon pools that are included within the category. Which subcategories are included? Deforestation. Deforestation in the greenhouse gas inventory is the combination of 5 subcategories, land use change subcategories. Forest land converted to cropland, forest land converted to grassland, forest land converted to settlement, and so on. So, which of them are impacted by the policy? If I have a policy that target the intensification of crop productivity to reduce the pressure on forest for new agricultural areas, then what is relevant to me is the conversion of forest land to cropland and maybe forest land to grassland, but I don't care. So my policy doesn't touch the conversion of forest land to settlement, to new city, to new settlement, because it is out of the scope of the policy. Then what is the spatial coverage? It covers the entire category or just a subdivision? My policies have been implemented just in 3 regions. Maybe I may do as country-specific cases. Brazil has these policies in the legal Amazon, and then the legal Amazon is the region impacted. The others are not part of the policy. Now, okay, I know that Brazil is doing effort also in the other region, but it was just an example. And then the temporal coverage. How much is going to last my activity? I'm going to subsidize the reforestation of abandoned land for the next 10 years. That's it. I will not have then in place any further monitoring system to check if the plantation is still there, because anyhow I'm not going to give any more money to the farmer or to whoever has converted this land to forest. So note that the leakage is indeed when you have a partial coverage of a greenhouse gas category, so a subdivision. The example before, I'm going to subsidize or whatever doing, I'm going to implement a policy in a region of my country, in a state of my country. Whatever happens in the other states is not controlled by this policy, then it may happen that I reduce the emissions in this region because the policy is effective, but some of the conversion, in this case, let's say if it's deforestation, some of the deforestation has been just shifted in other states or region. And this is the famous displacement of emission. If the policy covers the entire country, you don't have this kind of issue. Then the temporal limit. Already Anke discussed the reversal of achieved result. I'm doing still the sample of my subsidies for reforestation. I'm giving subsidy for a certain period, then the subsidy stop. Maybe the forest will be still there, maybe not. So what happened to permanence? On this we will have a slide at the end, but already here, because the nature of the greenhouse gas inventory that is continuous, the greenhouse gas inventory will never stop. And because the Paris Agreement, let's say, accounting mechanism is based on this national inventory report, I guess my understanding is that the permanence of whatever mitigation action implemented by the country and tracked through the greenhouse gas inventory is ensured by the fact that anyhow, even if the implementation of the mitigation action stops, the greenhouse gas inventory will keep reporting on those carbon stock that has been accumulated there. So any future reversal will be reported by the greenhouse gas inventory, then can be accounted for at the time. But be aware, this permanence is also, which is also, well, it's more a legacy issue. There is, when I stop to subsidize my reforestation and then to account for it, I may allow the achieved result. But be aware that my forest doesn't stop to grow when I stop to provide the subsidy. So there is also an amount that may have not been accounted for by my mitigation action that will be stored, removed from the atmosphere and then stored for the following years. And still, the greenhouse gas inventory will take care, will report also about this. So here we may have, here I have an example of stratification for RED plus. I said that we need to stratify the mitigation action within the greenhouse gas inventory. Here exercise to stratify, but this also comes from the Global Forest Conservation Initiative guidance, how the class activities may be stratified within the greenhouse gas inventories category. So deforestation is within the subcategories forested land uses. All these 4 categories, activities, RED plus activities, may be stratified within the forest land, remaining forest land, and the enhancement of carbon stock through afforestation is part of this other land use category. You see, it's not so complicated at the end to do this. Maybe this can be a more easy case, but it's possible to stratify mitigation action within the greenhouse gas inventory, almost always. And be aware that if you don't find the category in the greenhouse gas inventory, because the greenhouse gas inventory has not that category, is unlikely. For our sector, I guess it's very, very unlikely. For the LULUCF, I don't see the cases. But I remember a country that was reporting the fossilization of a carbon stock in the waste disposal site. It's a doubtful mitigation option, but maybe. There is always, the greenhouse gas inventory always allowed to report additional categories. Of course, this should not be, must not be a double counting of what is already reported in the greenhouse gas inventory category. But if you have something that is not captured, is additional to what is in the greenhouse gas inventory category, you may report an additional category called other, and there stratify your mitigation action. But you must avoid double counting. So once a mitigation action is stratified, you see it's quite easy. Let's say this is the subdivision of my mitigation action. The greenhouse gas, the emissions before the implementation were going in this way. Then I implemented my mitigation action, and then I start to have this other trend. It's an effective mitigation action. Of course, the results is the difference between what is occurring here and what either depends by the country. Country use the base year, so a single value, what was here, or in these other cases, what was the historical level of emission there. In the LULUCF sector, usually you never use the base year. You go for the average, because as we will see, we have to consider the impact of the famous internal variability. We have disturbances that do not occur with the same intensity and frequency each year, and they may also be predominant to the signal of the management activities, so may really create an issue. The internal variability may really create an issue if you just select a single base year value instead of an average. Next, the LULUCF sector. So this, what I said till here is valid for whatever sector, not just for the land use sector. Here we enter in our sector, in the land use sector. The land use sector has two characteristics. The so-called legacy effect. If I do something this year in terms of a management activity,
Sandro, I guess we lost your voice. Could you please check your settings before you continue? Okay, guys, it seems that Sandro is off. Maybe I just suggest that we take a question that had been formulated for Anke in the context of her presentation. So there was the question of Emilio, which actually I think it's basically two questions. One part has already been responded by Anke in the chat function to all, but Emilio also asked for a case where you would have applied a Tier 1 approach to determine the emissions for an agricultural activity, and that this often can pose a problem as Tier 1 methodologies don't capture management improvements. And the question to Anke would be, what happens in the case you change the methodology? Maybe you can expand a bit on this question, Anke.
Well, when you change the methodology, the IPCC guidelines require you that you recalculate your time series of emissions back to a base year that has been used. And we have a similar provision in the Paris Agreement that also addresses this consistency of methodologies over time. And like in relation to the NDCs, that would be more kind of like the period, the implementation period of the specific NDC that should be consistent, and where you then would need to kind of like try to develop an approach that you kind of like recalculate some of the earlier inventories. But I think now it would not be really kind of like the earlier inventories that developing countries submitted, but that would be more kind of like in the future that you would start reporting from some point after 2020, and then when you would change a method maybe in 2025, then you would go back to some of the earlier years for that period that is covered by the NDC. But it is an important provision to ensure that the reduction effect that is shown in the inventory is not due to a methodological change. And the comment is really good, because agriculture is definitely one of the sectors where a change in the methods and higher tier methods can considerably influence the level of emissions. For example, I remember when Germany, my own country, implemented the 2006 IPCC guidelines in the agricultural sector. The total emission from agriculture were reduced by 30%, which was really substantial. But in relation to the time series of emissions, the effect was not really visible, because kind of like the 30% was the effect in all the years. It was an effect of kind of like changed default emission factors that had a quite considerable effect in on the German emissions. So on our trend in emission, the effect was basically zero, but on the level it was quite considerable. And that is a particular, I think, factor that affects the agriculture sector.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Anke. I guess we will soon have back Sandro. But meanwhile, there was also a set of questions about the topic of leakage and how it could be tracked, also including IPCC methodologies. And I mean, there might also be sometimes before rain effects that impact national mitigations, as it was an issue raised by Leandra. So I don't know, Anke, if you would also feel comfortable to answer that question. If not, we wait until Sandro is back.
No, I think I would wait for Sandro.
Sandro, are you back already? It seems he's here, but his microphone is not working. As we are very close already to the time you probably all have blocked. We have already used up this 1.5 hour. Maybe I just can start to give already the final show you some final slides, because what I wanted to show you was the website of the or the link to the transparency website, and also to hint on some publications we will have there. There's one existing that takes up on the accounting principles and specifies how they could be applied at the national level. We will also have presentations that respond part of the questions that have been forwarded by several of you, which are about the details of the presentation that Anke has been given. So how you can really track mitigation actions through IPCC methodologies, especially when it comes down to improved management, be it for nitrogen fertilization, improved crop rotations, and this kind of specific agricultural actions. We will address this in our outstanding publications. So please I'd invite you to check on the Transparency Partnership website within the coming months. You're also free to contact us in the Accounting Rules project. You could contact directly me. My email is daniel.blank@giz.de, or also to get in touch directly with Anke or Sandro. It's been a lot of information I think we've shared with you. As promised earlier, we will definitely also check with our colleagues in Colombia, where we have a really interesting investigation ongoing about how to connect the registry for REG activities they have in Colombia, that operates on the project level with the national accounting level, and you would have, and there are issues of double counting of areas, as it has been mentioned by Anke as a potential problem. And the results of this research would be shared in an upcoming webinar then with you. And this is some kind of outlook, but in a nutshell, I'd say that from the Accounting Rules project through the PATPA network and website, we will keep in touch with you. And I just say thanks again to Anke and also to Sandro for their really detailed presentations, where I'd say that we definitely were not able to touch or to go into every detail of these very technical questions, but the presentations we will have definitely will go further into detail. Let's build a network. This is definitely something we've learned, that it's very important. FIO and other institutions at the national level, they are working strongly on improving emission factors and improving activity data in the AFOLU sector, and I think combining all this work that happens at the international and the national level definitely will help us also to improve IPCC methodologies, so that some of its current shortcomings hopefully can soon be overcome and be used to raise ambition at the global level. Thanks a lot to all of you. I think we close here, and let's keep in touch, and looking forward to having you aboard in the upcoming webinar on Colombia's experience. Thanks.
We will send you an email with a link to the presentations. We were sorry that we couldn't finish the presentation of Sandro. You can write to us also to the email of the webinar series, which is webinar.ndc.accounting@giz.de. I will write it to you on the chat.